For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant, ignored by the galaxy, dismissed by those in power, recorded, categorized, and quietly written off. To the Galactic Council, humans were an inconvenience wrapped in ambition. Too young to be trusted, too divided to be respected. They questioned laws older than their species, challenged hierarchies that had ruled the stars for millennia, and refused to accept that tradition alone justified authority. That made them noisy. But noise was not the same as threat. By every measure the Council valued, humanity ranked low. Their fleets were small. Their technology was clever but inelegant. Their political systems were chaotic, inefficient, and constantly arguing with themselves. Compared to civilizations that measured history in tens of thousands of years, humans were flashes, brief, energetic, and ultimately disposable. Council analysts labeled them low impact. Strategists labeled them containable. Archivists labeled them temporary. And so the galaxy stopped paying attention. When human trade declined, it was blamed on internal dysfunction. When colonies withdrew from shared infrastructure, it was chalked up to political infighting. When diplomatic channels went quiet, the assumption was easy. Humanity had failed. Species failed all the time. Some collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. Some were absorbed by stronger neighbors. Some simply faded when the universe stopped tolerating their growth. Humanity, with all its noise and division, seemed destined for the same quiet end. The Council closed the file. No fleets were sent to investigate the growing silence. No observers dispatched to confirm extinction. There were always more pressing concerns: border disputes, trade negotiations, internal unrest among client species. Humanity wasn't worth the resources. What the Council never understood was that humanity had never been fragile. They had been dependent. Dependent on trade routes that could be cut. Dependent on permissions that could be revoked. Dependent on systems designed by those who believed control was the same as stability. And when those supports vanished, something fundamental changed. Humanity did not collapse outward in chaos. They collapsed inward. They shed excess. They discarded assumptions. They dismantled structures that existed only to please others. The broadcasts stopped. The arguments faded. The noise disappeared, not because humanity had died, but because it had begun to focus. While the galaxy mistook silence for extinction, humanity was doing what it had always done best when cornered: adapting. They stopped trying to earn approval from powers that would never see them as equals. They stopped building for prestige and started building for endurance. They stopped asking how to succeed within the galaxy's rules, and began asking how to survive when those rules inevitably failed. No one was watching. That was the mistake. Because the most dangerous moment in human history was never their wars, their divisions, or their early expansion. It was the moment the Council believed humanity was gone, and left them alone long enough to become something the galaxy no longer knew how to measure. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not with fleets or open declarations of war, but with policy, quiet, clinical, and suffocating. Humanity was placed under provisional oversight, a designation that sounded temporary while granting the Council total leverage over every remaining connection humans had to the wider galaxy. Trade was cut. Human shipping licenses were suspended, pending compliance reviews that never concluded. Entire categories of goods were quietly reclassified as restricted: reactor components, medical compounds, navigation cores, now unavailable to human buyers. Dockyards delayed clearance until fuel reserves ran thin. Contracts froze. Credit access vanished behind layers of regulation designed to exhaust rather than resolve. Within months, supply chains that had taken generations to build unraveled. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost their voting privileges in council chambers. Then their right to speak. Then their access entirely. Travel permits were restricted under the guise of security. Surveillance mandates were imposed for protection. Council law, ancient, flexible, and selectively enforced, was suddenly applied with ruthless precision. Every action was legal. Every justification immaculate. Every appeal denied. Humanity protested through the only channels the Council allowed. They cited treaties signed in good faith. Mutual defense clauses. Shared wars fought side by side. Human fleets had bled alongside Council armadas. Human engineers had rebuilt worlds not their own. The Council acknowledged the filings, then archived them. Sanctions tightened further. Insurance guilds raised transit costs until civilian travel became impossible. Navigation beacons along human routes went dark for maintenance. Communication relays lagged, then failed, as service contracts were quietly terminated. Humanity was pushed into isolation, and the Council watched carefully. They expected collapse. They had seen the pattern countless times. A species dependent on interstellar trade fractured quickly once cut off. Economies failed. Political rivalries turned violent. Colonies turned on one another over dwindling resources. Refugees flooded outward, begging for reinstatement and protection. Humanity, divided and argumentative by nature, should have shattered first. It didn't. Months passed. Then years. There were no refugee armadas. No mass distress calls. No desperate broadcasts pleading for mercy. Instead, human traffic rerouted inward with unsettling coordination. Peripheral colonies, once dismissed as marginal, suddenly became centers of activity. Council analysts flagged the data as anomalous. Supervisors dismissed it. They assumed humanity was burning through reserves in a final, desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Dying civilizations often appeared productive just before the end. It fit precedent. It fit expectation. Then human space went quiet. Not the chaotic silence of collapse, but something deliberate. No broadcasts. No demands. No threats. No pleas. To the Council, that silence meant confirmation. Gone. Monitoring files were closed. Observers reassigned. Humanity was quietly reclassified as a non-viable civilization, another entry in the long archive of species that had failed to adapt to galactic order. The Council moved on. They never asked why human industrial output had spiked just before the silence. Never questioned why energy readings rose instead of fell. Never wondered why a collapsing species stopped asking for help altogether. They never considered that humanity had reached a conclusion of its own. That dependence was weakness. That permission was vulnerability. That survival meant removing every system that could be taken away. The Council believed isolation was a punishment. For humanity, it was a cleansing. Every sanction stripped away reliance. Every revoked right burned off illusion. Every closed door forced reinvention. The Council expected collapse. What they created instead was a civilization that no longer needed the galaxy's approval to exist, and therefore no longer needed the galaxy at all. By the time the Council believed humanity was gone, humanity had already begun learning how to endure unseen. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first, there was disbelief, then anger, then fear. Not the loud, panicked kind, but the quiet, clarifying kind that forces hard decisions. When the last Council trade lanes closed and the final appeals vanished into bureaucratic silence, humanity reached the same conclusion across every world it had ever settled. No one was coming. For centuries, humanity had carried its fractures into space. Old nations rebade as colonies. Corporate blocs wielding power rivaling governments. Ideologies transplanted whole onto distant planets. Those divisions survived because the galaxy allowed them to, because trade softened consequences and external authority absorbed the cost of failure. Isolation stripped that illusion away. When shipments stopped, ideology didn't matter. When jump routes vanished, borders became meaningless. When Council patrols ignored human distress calls, denial gave way to clarity. Division was no longer inefficient. It was fatal. Old divisions vanished, not through conquest or revolution, but necessity. Arguments that once dragged on for decades were resolved in days. Sometimes hours. Not because humanity suddenly agreed on everything, but because survival demanded cooperation. You either worked together, or you didn't survive. Emergency assemblies formed across human space. Not parliaments. Not senates. Coordination councils. They were led not by career politicians, but by people who understood systems. Logisticians who knew how to keep supply chains alive, engineers who understood what failed first under pressure, medics who knew what shortages actually killed people. The questions were brutally simple. How do we feed everyone? How do we keep power stable? How do we make sure no colony stands alone? Corporations resisted at first. Profit models collapsed without external markets. Some attempted hoarding, leveraging scarcity for control. They were outpaced, quickly, by cooperative networks that shared materials, labor, and data freely, producing more with less waste. Profit was replaced with continuity. Military forces followed. Fleets that once answered to different flags began operating together out of necessity. Joint patrols became shared commands. Shared commands hardened into permanent structures. Uniforms lost national insignia. Ship hulls lost ownership markings. Culture remained. Identity remained. Authority changed. All colonies stood under one command. It wasn't declared. It wasn't voted on. It emerged. Command was not a government. It did not dictate belief, language, or culture. It coordinated survival. When command issued a directive, it was followed, not out of loyalty, but because it worked. Power grids synchronized. Food production stabilized. Manufacturing standards unified. A ship built in one system could be repaired in another without modification. Medical protocols standardized across worlds. Mortality rates dropped even as resources tightened. Redundancy replaced efficiency. Resilience replaced optimization. Humanity stopped functioning like competing states. They began functioning like a single organism. Education shifted almost overnight. Children learned systems thinking before history. Emergency response before politics. Every human learned something practical: fabrication, repair, medicine, logistics. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as language. This wasn't militarization. It was preparation. Because if no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Defense replaced borders. Early warning arrays stretched far beyond mapped space, watching vectors no council doctrine had ever considered threats. Humanity assumed betrayal as a baseline. They assumed isolation would return. They assumed help would not arrive in time. So they built accordingly. The galaxy never noticed. Council observers had been reassigned. Sensor coverage reduced. Reports hinting at unusual coordination were buried under bureaucracy or dismissed as statistical noise. Humanity faded from relevance exactly as the Council expected. And humanity did nothing to correct that assumption. They had learned the value of being underestimated. While the Council congratulated itself on a problem solved, human space grew quieter and stronger. Colonies once separated by light years functioned like neighboring districts. Decisions that once took generations were made in days. Not through tyranny. Through shared responsibility. Isolation had done what centuries of diplomacy never could. It removed the illusion that someone else would step in. In its place, humanity built unity not from ideology, but necessity. Not from obedience, but trust. And when the galaxy eventually turned its attention back toward the region it believed was empty, it would not find a fractured species begging to be remembered. It would find something whole. Something prepared. Something that had learned the oldest rule of survival the hard way. If no one else will stand for you, you learn to stand together. In silence, humanity evolved. Cut off from the galaxy's endless noise, human space did not decay, it refined itself. There were no broadcasts meant to reassure outsiders. No demonstrations staged for approval that would never come. Progress became internal, focused, and unforgivingly practical. New engines came first. Humanity abandoned the galaxy's obsession with shortcuts through reality. Hyperspace lanes, fold corridors, slipstreams, all fast, all elegant, all dependent on infrastructure that could be denied, sabotaged, or controlled. Humans chose something else. Endurance. They built engines that pushed directly against spacetime itself. Drives that converted mass, time, and relentless persistence into motion. Inefficient by council standards. Brutal on materials. Slow compared to sanctioned travel. But they were absolute. Human ships no longer required lanes, gates, or permission. If space existed, they could cross it. Travel became a matter of inevitability rather than access. They didn't arrive quickly. They arrived no matter what. Unbreakable shields followed. Not graceful energy veils meant to win brief, glorious engagements, but layered systems of brutal redundancy. Fields nested within fields, reinforced by physical mass, geometric dispersion, and adaptive algorithms that treated damage as information. Human shields did not try to cancel force. They absorbed it, distributed it, learned from it. Energy bled away into harmless radiation. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Every strike refined the system further. Failure was not an outcome, it was feedback. Hull plating thickened until ships resembled drifting continents. Armor wasn't decorative, it was grown, replaced, and grown again. Vital systems were buried beneath entire ecosystems: farms, reservoirs, fabrication bays, medical wards. Even catastrophic damage became survivable. Human ships stopped being vehicles. They became habitats that moved. Fleets were built, but not for conquest. There were no banners painted on hulls. No heroic names etched into armor. Ships were identified by function and redundancy, not legacy. Ark-class vessels protected populations. Foundry fleets manufactured replacements mid-transit. Defense lattices functioned as mobile terrain rather than aggressive spearheads. Every loss was anticipated. Every role replaceable. Every ship expendable, except the people inside. Weapons existed, but they were tools, not symbols. Interdiction fields to halt advance. Area denial arrays to make approach catastrophically costly. Precision null systems designed to remove threats cleanly and permanently. Humanity did not build weapons to inspire fear. They built weapons to end danger. Artificial intelligence, once feared, once restricted, was rebuilt under unforgiving principles. No gods. No masters. Partners only. Every system assumed error rather than perfection, betrayal rather than loyalty, failure rather than success. Human oversight was mandatory. Human responsibility absolute. Biology advanced alongside steel. Human physiology adapted quietly. Radiation tolerance increased. Cellular repair accelerated. Immune systems became aggressive, self-updating networks. Humans didn't become visibly different. They became harder to kill. Generations grew up inside this preparation. Children learned fabrication and repair alongside language and mathematics. Emergency response became basic education. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as reading. This wasn't militarization. It was survival literacy. Beyond human space, the galaxy remained unaware. The Council was busy managing politics, suppressing dissent, and congratulating itself on stability. Data that contradicted humanity's supposed collapse was filtered, reinterpreted, or quietly discarded. It was easier not to look. And so the galaxy never saw the fleets forming beyond known maps. Never saw engines that ignored borders. Never saw shields that endured forces capable of shattering moons. Never saw a civilization that had stopped seeking approval and started building permanence. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Not to return. Not to conquer. But to endure long enough to decide what happened next. When silence was no longer an option. Then a new enemy appeared. There was no warning broadcast. No declaration of war. No demand for surrender. One cycle, the outer systems reported routine traffic and stable lanes. The next, those systems were screaming, and then they were silent. The first world fell in less than a day. Long-range sensors captured fragments before failing entirely. Massive spatial distortions, fleets emerging without lanes, ships that ignored every known law of propulsion. The invaders were colossal and asymmetrical, grown rather than constructed, their hulls shifting as if alive. They called themselves the Dominion. Worlds fell. Council defense fleets mobilized as fast as doctrine allowed, far too slow. They arrived to find debris fields where orbital cities had once hung. Moons were dismantled for raw material. Planetary crusts were split open with industrial precision. Atmospheres burned not as targets, but as waste heat. The Dominion did not conquer. They harvested. Entire systems were stripped and abandoned, left silent and lifeless. Borders meant nothing. Treaties meant nothing. The Dominion advanced with relentless certainty, consuming everything useful and discarding the rest. Species were enslaved. Survivors were processed with mechanical indifference. Engineers were implanted with control nodes and forced to maintain Dominion warforms. Soldiers were chemically altered, stripped of identity, and driven back into battle as expendable shock units. Civilian populations were reduced to labor stock, biological components feeding an ever-expanding machine. Those deemed unnecessary were erased. Refugees poured into council space carrying stories too horrific to dismiss. Worlds converted into processing hubs. Cultures erased not through massacre, but repurposing. Entire histories ended without a single memorial. The galaxy panicked. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions that stretched on for cycles. Representatives shouted over one another, demanding action while assigning blame. Ancient powers argued jurisdiction. Younger species begged for protection. Military blocs refused to commit fleets without guarantees of reimbursement and command authority. The Council argued while systems burned. Votes were proposed. Votes were delayed. Votes were vetoed. Coalitions formed on paper and collapsed in practice. Fleets mobilized too slowly, bound by doctrines designed for limited wars, not extinction. Every decision required consensus, and consensus arrived only after another star went dark. When Council armadas finally met the Dominion in force, the results were catastrophic. Entire fleets vanished. Flagships were torn apart mid-transmission. The Dominion sacrificed ships freely, learning from every engagement, adapting faster than Council tacticians could respond. Weapons that had once decided wars barely slowed them. Within a few short cycles, the truth became unavoidable. The Council was losing. Worse, they had no plan left. Then analysts noticed something unsettling. On Dominion expansion maps, there was a void. A vast region of space they did not enter. Not fortified. Not contested. Simply avoided. Advance vectors curved around it. Probes altered course without explanation. Entire Dominion fleets diverted as if responding to a threat no one could see. That region matched old charts. Human space. The realization spread through the Council chamber like a vacuum breach. Humanity. A species isolated, sanctioned, and quietly written off as extinct. A civilization the Council believed was gone, and yet something about them caused an empire that devoured stars to hesitate. Desperation replaced pride. Dormant channels were reactivated. Deprecated frequencies restored. Messages were drafted with careful language, acknowledging past misunderstandings, emphasizing shared extinction-level risk, invoking unity and survival. The first message went unanswered. So did the second. Worlds continued to fall. Finally, stripped of ceremony and pretense, the Council broadcast a single, unfiltered transmission across every channel humanity had ever used. "We need your help." The reply came minutes later. Not from an ambassador. Not from a politician. From a calm, steady voice identified only as command. "We know," the voice said. "We've been observing." Relief surged through the chamber. Councilors spoke at once, offering restored rights, full reintegration, shared authority, anything to secure humanity's aid. The human voice cut through the noise. "You isolated us. You revoked our rights. You believed we were gone," command said. "What is happening now is not our responsibility." Panic erupted. "If the Dominion wins," a councilor pleaded, "humanity will fall as well." There was a pause, long enough to feel endless. "Yes," command replied. "Eventually." Hope flickered. "So you'll help." "We didn't say that," the voice answered. "We said we understand the threat." Council displays changed. Data flooded the chamber. Dominion logistics, behavioral models, structural weaknesses mapped with chilling precision. Entire campaigns already simulated. Failure points identified. Casualty projections calculated to unsettling accuracy. Humanity hadn't just been watching. They had been preparing. "We will engage the Dominion," command said at last. "Because extinction-level threats do not respect borders." Relief washed through the chamber. "But understand this," the voice continued, colder now. "This is not a rescue." A pause. "This is the consequence of believing we were gone." The transmission ended, and as Dominion fleets advanced deeper into Council space, the galaxy finally understood the truth behind humanity's silence. They had not vanished. They had not fallen. They had been waiting for a threat worthy of answering. The Council expected forgiveness. They believed desperation had a way of rewriting memory, that when extinction loomed close enough, old betrayals would blur into necessity. Humanity, they assumed, would be angry, but relieved, ready to return, ready to help, ready to forget. They were wrong. What the Council found instead was resolve. When dormant human channels finally came alive, the Council chamber erupted in chaos. Delegates spoke over one another, rushing to offer what had once been stripped away: restored rights, permanent seats, shared military authority, reparations approved without debate. Concessions denied for centuries were now handed out in moments. Humanity listened. Then they answered calmly, "We will decide when to act." The words landed like vacuum. Council representatives protested immediately. Time was running out. Every delay meant another world lost, another species enslaved. They demanded schedules, fleet movements, guarantees, anything that sounded like control. They were given none. "Urgency did not save you," the human voice continued, "identified only as command. It blinded you. We will not repeat that mistake." The transmission ended. Silence followed, heavy, suffocating, unfamiliar. For the first time in galactic history, survival no longer rested on ancient authority or collective vote. It rested on the judgment of a species the Council had already written off, and that species was not rushing. Far beyond charted space, something began to move. In regions long marked as empty, where gravity maps blurred and sensor returns dissolved into static, human constructs awakened. Structures seeded during the earliest days of isolation came online in flawless synchronization, responding to signals that had never been broadcast. Foundries ignited. Stars were tapped, not consumed, not destroyed, but shaped. Their output redirected into controlled torrents of energy feeding colossal frameworks wrapped in reinforced spacetime fields. Fleets long hidden aligned along vectors no Council doctrine had ever charted. Soon after, space itself began to tremble. Not from hyperspace ruptures. Not from weapons fire. From strain. Across the galaxy, sensors screamed as localized distortions appeared in synchronized patterns light-years apart. Reality flexed, stabilized, then flexed again, like a structure being tested far beyond its original limits. Humanity was not mobilizing. They were initializing. The Council finally understood the difference. Whatever humanity was preparing was not a desperate response to the Dominion. It was a solution conceived long ago, refined in silence, and held in reserve for a moment exactly like this. The Dominion qualified. Whether the Council did, was no longer relevant. Humanity had not returned seeking forgiveness. They had not emerged to reclaim status or demand restitution. They had returned because something existed that threatened continuity itself. And when they finally acted, it would not be because the Council begged. It would be because humanity had finished deciding how the future of the galaxy would be written, and who would be allowed to survive in it. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. There was no warning flare, no hyperspace rupture, no spike in emissions for sensors to latch onto. One moment, Dominion armadas filled the void, vast, devouring formations advancing toward the last defensible systems. The next moment, humanity was there. Space did not tear open. It yielded. Massive human constructs unfolded along vectors the Dominion had never considered threats. Arc ships the size of moons anchored the formation, their gravity wells stabilizing the surrounding void. Vast lattice platforms stretched across entire approach corridors, turning open space into controlled terrain. Foundry fleets aligned behind them, already fabricating replacements for losses that had not yet occurred. They were massive. They were precise. They were unstoppable. Human vessels emitted nothing recognizable. No drive plumes. No weapon charge signatures. Dominion targeting systems returned contradictory data, range without mass, mass without location, as if the human fleet existed slightly out of phase with the rules the Dominion understood. They did not advance. They waited. Then a single message crossed every channel. Unencrypted. Unfiltered. Translated instantly into every known language. Stand down. The Dominion answered with annihilation. Entire formations surged forward, sacrificing themselves to breach the human line. Planet cracker lances fired. Reality warping weapons detonated. Space burned white as the Dominion unleashed everything it had ever used to erase resistance. The human fleet did not move. Their shields flexed, layered systems absorbing, dispersing, and nullifying forces that had shattered stars. Energy bled away into harmless radiation. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Human hulls did not glow. Armor did not fracture. Humanity endured. Then they responded. Not with fury. With correction. Regions of space hardened. Dominion ships slowed, then stopped entirely, trapped in volumes where physics itself refused to cooperate. Propulsion systems failed. Weapons shut down mid-cycle. Entire fleets froze mid-charge like insects suspended in amber. Human counterfire began. It was not a barrage. It was removal. Dominion vessels vanished one by one, erased by localized null events that left no debris, no explosion, only absence. Command ships disappeared first. Control nodes followed. Each strike eliminated something essential, unraveling the Dominion structure with surgical inevitability. The Dominion attempted to adapt. They always did. But there was nothing to adapt to. Human tactics did not escalate. They did not change. They remained constant, methodical, as if the outcome had been calculated long before the first ship appeared. Retreat vectors collapsed before they could be used. Reinforcements never arrived. Communication across Dominion formations degraded into static, then silence. Then the Dominion's command intelligence, an entity believed to span multiple dimensions, went dark. No death cry. No final transmission. It simply stopped. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Across the galaxy, Council sensors struggled to process what they were witnessing. Battles that should have lasted centuries concluded in minutes. Systems once doomed to fall went quiet, not occupied, not conquered, but spared. Human fleets did not pursue. They powered down. A final transmission followed, brief and absolute. The threat has been neutralized. Do not pursue remnants. And then humanity withdrew. Space relaxed. Physics resumed its familiar shape. Human ships vanished as cleanly as they had arrived, leaving behind stunned silence, and survivors who barely understood why they were still alive. The Galactic Council watched in disbelief. Because at last, the truth was undeniable. Humanity had not returned to fight a war. They had returned to end one. And they had done it so completely that the galaxy barely had time to realize it had been saved. By the species it had once believed was gone. The Council tried to reclaim control. In the aftermath of the Dominion's erasure, emergency sessions filled the ancient halls once more. Borders were reaffirmed. Authority was restated. Committees formed to oversee reconstruction, defense realignment, and post-crisis stability. The Council spoke as if order had been preserved by its wisdom, as if events had unfolded within acceptable margins. It was too late. The galaxy remembered. Worlds remembered the silence while they burned. Species remembered the debates that outlasted entire civilizations. Survivors remembered who argued, and who arrived. The Council still had fleets. They still had laws. They still had tradition measured in millennia. But power had moved. Humanity did not step forward to rule. They refused every offer. Permanent council seats. Supreme military authority. Emergency governance mandates over liberated systems. Each proposal was received, acknowledged, and declined with the same calm finality. "We are not here to govern," came the final human transmission. Governance creates dependence. Dependence creates collapse. Instead, humanity shared what they had learned in isolation. Stabilization systems capable of repairing planetary damage once thought irreversible. Defensive architectures designed to prevent extinction, not provoke escalation. Infrastructure models built on redundancy instead of efficiency, favoring endurance over elegance. They helped worlds rebuild. Then they left. Humanity did not dismantle the Council. They made it irrelevant. Across the galaxy, something subtle but irreversible changed. Species stopped assuming someone else would protect them. Defense replaced prestige. Preparation replaced complacency. The illusion that safety could be outsourced, to ancient powers, to treaties, to distant authorities, began to fade. The Council still existed, but it no longer defined survival. And humanity, they faded back into the dark. Not hiding, not isolated, waiting. Human space remained distant and undefined, its borders unmapped, its fleets unseen. They did not occupy trade routes. They did not demand recognition. They existed beyond known space, where sensors strained and certainty failed. Watching, listening, enduring. The Council never spoke of silencing humanity again. They never dared. Because the galaxy now understood a truth that could not be voted away, negotiated down, or forgotten. Humanity did not need to rule to matter. They did not need permission to act. They did not need gratitude to protect existence. They had survived abandonment. They had endured isolation. They had ended an extinction-level threat without becoming conquerors. And that changed the meaning of power forever. So when the stars finally grew quiet, when the Dominion became history instead of destiny, one certainty spread across the galaxy, whispered between worlds and recorded in every Sirius archive. If darkness rises again, if something ancient, merciless, or unimaginable reaches for the stars, humanity will be there. Not as rulers, not as saviors seeking praise, but as the ones who were forgotten once, and ensured the galaxy would never make that mistake again.